happy that we have so many critical people here today. That is really wonderful. Now, do we have this?
Yes, it's in that device there. It works.
Which device?
Up. Look for snipers.
Up there?
Yes.
And it works?
Yes.
Okay, let's see. Let's hope. Okay. Well, we can put one in already. The critical theory has, of course, a lot to do with anti-fascism and all this, so I thought we could have some movies in order to understand against what the critical theory is. So not what it is, but what it's against. And maybe, which one do you want? Maybe we can take the conspiracy first. Walter, can you put it in?
We'll put it in, and it only takes a moment to load up, so whenever you're done.
You are so trusting.
No.
You tested it?
Told you.
Yeah, we already tested it.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay, well, then I trust you more than technology. Okay. So, then we can start right away, right? Let's do that. Okay. You know what the title is, of course, Sociology 605, Newest Developments in the Frankfurt School. I think it didn't get into the catalog there, but the whole title was a little bit too long. And when I left, my syllabus fell apart because my machine, which is supposed to put this together, has no ammunition anymore. We have to put it in, okay? Well,
okay.
Let's do that as soon as possible. Otherwise the whole thing falls apart. Okay, this is something else which I could put together. And this, and so let's start out with introducing ourselves a little bit. So I would like to introduce myself and some of you right away. There are two gentlemen here. This is our friend Dustin, Walter. They are both my associates since many years. So they have written already in the Frankfurt School and written a master thesis. Walter is a specialist for Fromm, Erich Fromm, which is one of the critical theorists. And Dustin just went to the enemy there, which is Heidegger. And so one of the critical theorists, Adorno, the genius of the whole group, was of course very much an anti-Heidegger man. And Heidegger, as you know, was a fascist and died as such. And I just got a postcard from Germany, and there's something very peculiar on this, and I let it go through. There is a glass box, and in this glass box, in the middle of the street, there where I was born, in the west side of Frankfurt, and there is a table there, a desk and a chair. Nobody sits on the chair, thanks be to God. And there is a metronome, you know what you need when you play piano, tuck, 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 back and forth and so on, because Adorno was also a composer and a great pianist, and there is a light there so that he could write. So that is his desk, and they mentioned they named a street after him somewhere else in Frankfurt. He came from Frankfurt, and now they have put up this monument in the little glass box. So I let this go around, and now when you compare this, when Adorno died in 1969, the New York Times had some kind of a write-up on him. But the only thing what they could remember was that Adorno had written once an essay on the Schillerbock. I don't know if you still know this, what the Schillerbock is. It is some kind of a strange dance. But he had written, you know, introduction into philosophy of music, sociology of music, volumes and volumes. That shows you something already, namely that nonconformist intellectuals, and that's what we are talking about, have a harder time than conformist intellectuals. So the antagonism between those two groups, and we have them in our country, we have them in the West, in different countries, and we want to deal with nonconformist intellectuals, and of course the Frankfurt School are not the only ones. There are others as well, but we want to learn very clearly to differentiate, you know, who first of all is an intellectual. Not everybody who teaches in a university is already an intellectual. So, and then, of course, what is a conformist intellectual, what is his function, and what is a non-conformist intellectual? Do we have non-conformist intellectual on this campus, for instance? You know, that would be an honest question with a full honest answer. And so that is what we want to dig in here in our thing there. So let me just say a few things about myself, and Dustin, of course, and Walter know these things already. We will also have, I think I bought a little our thing here with me. You know, this what is it called there, which we did together there. So we can show this when I'm ended, and we can have that maybe the first one. And so we want to make some kind of a documentary about my work and our work and what we did in the last 50 years, and here in Europe, in Canada, and also little things which can be used in seminars and so on. And so we have started with this, and we're looking for funds. And Dustin is part of it, Walter is part of it, so that's our plan. And you can see it when I have just said a few things about my background. So, well, I'm coming from Frankfurt too, so that you can hear from the accent where the Frankfurt school comes from. But the question is, you know, how I got involved in this, because the question is, how do you get in contact with people like this? Here too, you have Kellner here and McIntyre and so, but how does one reach out to these people, and you know, how does one? And so I just want to say a few things about how that happened to me. That because I was born just maybe 10 minutes away from the Institute for Social Research, which is still there, which was bombed out lovingly by the American Air Force in the end of the war, but they rebuilt it again, and the American commissioner gave a lot of money to rebuild it again. He repented his sinful thing which he did, and so before that the fascists, the Nazis, had occupied it and had taken it away and driven out the critical theorists out of Frankfurt. So in 1933, when I halfway came to consciousness, that was when I became 6 years old. Of course, I didn't know exactly what was going on around me there. So I grew up in a working class area in Frankfurt, in a working class house, and now a little guy, you know, is slowly becoming aware of his environment, so always a little step further, and I had all kinds of terrible experiences. I had a little machine which was called a Hollander, I don't know why, but it had 4 wheels, and I had to go back and forth like this, and that is how I moved it. And once I had a little girlfriend. I was under 6, and I had a girlfriend, and she was sitting on the back. I could have a passenger. So I went on to the street, and then I drove to the street, and a big truck came and drove over the front of my little machine. And my feet were underneath there, but it didn't do anything to them. But the little girlfriend, of course, right away disappeared with a scream that you cannot depend on them. There is no faithfulness or whatever. So she just left. And so I was terribly afraid, not about myself, but what my father would say about this new machine that I had, because he had painted it nicely for Christmas, and it smelled beautiful, the colors there, so it was a beautiful machine. So I crawled inside, and I went to the basement, and then I looked through the basement window what was going on, because they were searching for me out there, and the police came, but I was gone. So I was sitting down there and observed that, like a nonconformist intellectual, observed the thing from the bottom up there. And so, well, my father was relatively mild. He was so happy that I was still there, although that I was not really punished for it. But this was one of those amazing experiences. And also something which is closely related to the experience, because the critical theorists, these non-conformist intellectuals, are not that what they are because they are stubborn or because they are neurotic or they cannot get along with people or whatever, but the war experience, of course, First World War and then the Second World War and fascism in between and the threat of a Third World War. So that is what fascinated them, and they somehow wanted to find out how that can happen. They were not working class. They were German middle class, not upper class really. Many of them were Jews, and they had, for instance, a big wine company, or that was Fromm's parents, Fromm's father, and Adorno's father had a similar business, and so the Horkheimer, the leader of the whole group, had a factory where he collected rags in the cities and transformed them into material again so that you could make clothing out of it, and so on. So that is this. It was not big corporations, but middle-range corporations with a few hundred people, but not working class. But they were nevertheless young, intelligent people like for instance, Marcuse, Horkheimer, and so on, who up in Berlin or in Stuttgart or in Frankfurt and saw what the war. And so what I experienced, for instance, when my mother and we went to friends in the neighborhood, these women all had no husband because they were all war widows. Their husbands, their brothers, and so on had not come back. So you had street after street after street, where in every apartment there is a widow with 2 or 3 children, and the husband never came back, and so on. So that was, when I was taken to the church, there was this, it was called the Women's Peace Church. And it was a nice big church, and there were all kinds of pillars. And on these pillars were the names of all the sons and fiancés and so on who had fallen from 1914 to 1918. And women, poor women all over Europe had brought that money together in order to build that. So that was the atmosphere of these widows. And then this church, which had a crypt underneath in the basement and so on, where there were special altars for those who had fallen and so on. So the whole atmosphere, it was from 1918 to 1939 when the next war started. So it was just 20 years or whatever. It's a very short time. But it was in this time when these very sensitive people, musicians, artists at the same time, were very much moved by this whole atmosphere, and the atmosphere I had in common with them, in spite of the fact that I didn't know them. There was later on, I was in the German Air Force, and I flew the M109, which you can see on the airport here. And one night after an American attack, the British attacked at night, the Americans at daytime. And I came from the airport. I had landed in the airport in Sossenheim, west of Frankfurt, and then there was no bus or whatever. So I walked home from the airport to my mother's house, never in Frankfurt, never knowing if that house would still be there. It was always, when I get to the last corner, is it still there or has it been hit or whatever? We were very happy. There was the IG Farben building there, which the Americans wanted to have as headquarters, so they didn't bomb it. So therefore, there were relatively few bombs in that area. That was but we didn't know this, of course. So, nevertheless, on the way, I went through that area where this Women's Peace Church was, into which my parents took me as a little boy, and it had been hit by an air mine. So half of it had been hit, and the air mine was unbelievably deep. They made huge holes. You could put the whole church into the hole there. And down in the hole, of course, the gas pipes had opened up, and so they were burning. It was ghostly. There was nobody there. Nobody was there. The houses were burning, the church was down, and dead bodies down there in this children, women, and the gas flames, and so it was hellish. I mean, it was Dante's Inferno, the lowest level of the whole thing. So, and I thought at that time, how horribly ironical that was, that all these German women, put up that monument in order to say that must never happen again. And there, symbolically enough, this air mine went into that thing and devastated. They rebuilt it again. It's there again today. So people, hope always goes newly, no matter what happens to people. There is a certain, particularly religious people, a certain decisionism. That means they decide they will hold on to God or God's love or God's providence, no matter how meaningless it is or how abandoned they are, or alone they are, or how much they are afraid of death or old or sickness and so on. They just cling to that. There is a secular form to this too, and in the Nazi period that was connected with Hitler. That was a decisionism. They made the decision, we believe in him, we believe in him, and so on. And there you had very simple people who in the last stages, he has this miracle weapon. He will get us out of this mess. He is the genius, and God is with him, and so on. So that's called decisionism. You have no real reason, rational argument. All the arguments are against you.
But you say, Carl Schmitt is the great fascist thinker who formulated this idea of decisionism, and we don't want to be judgmental or whatever, we just want to say it for a moment as a fact that there is this, because there is in the great world religions no answer to the so-called theodicy problem, why this all-loving God, why things are so horrible in his world for which he is responsible. And there is no theoretical answer to it in no world religion, in no theology, but there are practical theodicy solutions, and they are decisionist. That means where people say, what is in Paul, I think, formulated, nothing can separate us from the love of God. No death, no torture, no lions in the circus, and so on. We will hold on to it, and so on. So, nevertheless, that was one of these experience in Frankfurt. And also this Women's Peace Church was just a few minutes away from that institute, which, by the way, was called the Café Marx by the Nazis, the Café Marx. So it had something to do from the very beginning with Marxism. Now the west of Frankfurt were the poor people, and there were a lot of social democrats and a lot of communists. But these were middle-class fellows who did not really know poverty personally or so. I mean, they lived some kind of an elite life in terms of culture, in terms of music, theater, elite schools in Frankfurt. I went to one of them, the so-called Lessing Gymnasium, went into another one which was very similar, and Adorno as well. So therefore, when they called that Café Marx, it was a little bit strange what they really had to do. So my grandfather was a streetcar conductor in Frankfurt, and the center of the streetcars where they all came together was also right 5 minutes from the institute, and the professors from this institute, or the scholars, took that streetcar all the time. It went from there into the opera house, open house where the operas were played. It was dedicated to the true, the beautiful, and the good, and so on. And my grandfather started that in 1914, and these streetcars had no engine at that time. They had a horse. So therefore he guided the horse through the street, and then he had to go through the car and had a little box hanging here, and there you put the 10 cents in or whatever. So I saw him still when he did this before he was retired. But I don't think that my grandfather had any idea, who the critical theorists were, or the critical theorists had no idea who my grandfather was there. So they talked, the critical theorists talked for a proletariat, as this box called this, without having lived with this proletariat, and so on. And if they would have lived with them and would have started with them, could they really have built that theory? Could they have acquired this type of education? So you have here this whole thing, between theory and praxis, the whole time, as if you want to build a real theory and you want to study this and so on, can you really do that when you have to work in the factory? Or, some of you experience this, you have to work and then you have to study, and you know how difficult that is, So, or if you have children, and then you will study. I had my 14 grandchildren at home. There's a barbarian invasion, and you can do nothing, absolutely nothing. I mean, they make sure that you cannot do nothing. You cannot read a book. You cannot even read an essay. You cannot even read a page. Every minute somebody comes and tells you a story from Adam and Eve to the present, and so it's a hopeless case. So, nevertheless, I thought that very often. My grandfather was sinking down in the class system, and that was, of course, also in the background. You know that the Germans had won a war, the so-called Russian War of 1870, when the Germans marched into Paris and conquered it, and then, of course, demanded reparations, and the French had to pay massively. And the Germans used that money in order to build up their cities. So the city core of Frankfurt and Stuttgart and so on, that is all was built with French reparation money and so on. So now these cities, which were suddenly had electricity, and the movies came slowly and without sound, and then with sound and so on. My grandfather was one of those who was fascinated by this. He lived in a village not too far away, Originally, we are Huguenots. That means we were Protestants in France, and there's the Bartholomew night, as you know, where the massacre took place, and then these Protestants were driven out, and the Prince of Hessen was a Protestant. He took them in, and that is how my ancestors got into Hessen. And and my grandfather then had a farm, and he had 2 horses, and he had a bakery. But there was no light, there were no lanterns, there was just a village all night, and he had to get up at 4 o'clock and bake the bread for the other farmers and so on. And there was, 20 miles away, was the city of Frankfurt, and the lights went on the streets, and so it was like paradise, it was like a utopia, like, the longing for Greece, or the longing for America, so though it was the longing for these growing cities. And he did it. By 1900, he decided to leave all this behind, this village, and go to this beautiful Frankfurt and have this great life. But of course, he had no idea that he was, really declassified in a certain sense, that he went from a farmer status, from ownership, down to having nothing except a miserable horse, which had to pull that thing there, at least till August 1914. I think then they electrified the whole thing, and they put an engine into it, but then he had this little thing which he had to turn around so that the connection with the electricity up there was there, and that is what he did all day long, instead of being a baker and having some kind of a trade or so. So he was moving from the low middle class into the working class, and not even very high in the working class. And so but the horrible thing was that, of course, the embargo on Germany starved Germany out from 1915 on, and so on. So particularly the people in the cities now had nothing to eat. And so he had to walk those 20 miles to that village and go to his friends and beg for some potatoes and bread and so on. The humiliation already, they said, well, why did you go? You were lured by the devil there into going to the city, and so if you had stayed here, you could feed your wife and your children. You had 4 children. And so, but he couldn't even bring enough back, and so my grandmother starved to death in the First World War. And then in the Second World War it was the same thing, and now his daughter and his sons went up into the village and started begging again. So they did pay, they brought the carpets along, or they exchanged stuff what they had in the house for potatoes and apples and so on, and carried it over miles and miles into the city. And so my grandfather then starved to death in the Second World War. So this is the suffering of the masses of the people in wars and so on. But they're personal, the personal level, as we say today, to make the right decision or whatever, And he made one wrong decision, one could say, a regrettable one, and he had to suffer for it for all his life. And he was humbled by this, and he was a very wonderful. So I loved him a lot, and he was very helpful. He had 3 little gardens all over Frankfurt, and he walked from one to the other and planted little carrots and whatever, and fed some of the family. But for the war, it was not enough to sustain families. So, nevertheless, that is, I just tell you this in order to show the atmosphere where these people, where this Frankfurt school was situated. So they were situated in the real thing, but they were not from that thing. They lived somewhere else. So particularly the Jewish population lived on the east side of the city, and that was the big palaces they had built. And then there was Rothschild, So when Hitler attacks the Jewish high finance and speculative capital and fought here too, Frankfurt, they came from Germany. The Rothschilds today have the headquarters in Paris and in New York. But they come from Frankfurt, so they started very small with the money exchange and giving loans and banking business, and were tremendously successful and financed the 70 War and financed also the First World War. And this is the threat, which Hitler did 4 or 5 times in speeches in the Diet. If the Jewish high finance, that was Rothschild, if they will push the European nation, the Aryan nations, once more into a brotherly war, fratricidal, brother murder war, then this will not be the end of Europe. but it will be the end of the Jewish race. And the World War became a World War with Pearl Harbor. And that was when the Wannsee meeting took place, and that's the movie which we want to see a little bit today. And so in Wannsee, then the Heydrich and Himmler, Eichmann, they set up the plan for all the officials of the different government branches and dictated this plan. This plan did not have Hitler's signature. They assured the government official that Hitler had signed it, but he never signed up on it. And the question in Germany, everything was signed by Hitler, and so why is this missing? He left it to the underlings to do that. Not so that they would say later on it had nothing to do with it, but he was so busy with something else, and that something else was, of course, communism. It was socialism. It was Marxism. That had to be annihilated. We rightly remember the 6 million Jews, but there were 27 million communists whom he murdered. And that was the real thing. So for Hitler's consciousness, the Jewish thing was a footnote affair. The 6 million were a footnote to the 27 million. It's very hard and very cruel even to say this or to look at things like this, but there was this mentality against which the critical theory fought against, from 1914 on up to the day and into the future, because that remains a potential, this whole attitude. This sometimes, we are not too far away from it. When Hitler talked in East Prussia in his headquarters, he had another headquarters down in the Ukraine near Kiev, where we went there recently. But he gave speeches there, and there he would, sometimes mention this Jewish thing, but he never mentioned. He said, people in the world say we are putting those Jews close to lakes and where the atmosphere is not very healthy. Who has mercy with our soldiers who have to march to Moscow and freeze and so on and so on. But it seems he had nothing to do with this and so on. But the reason for that was that he was totally occupied by Bolshevism, which was the secularized form of Judaism and Christianity. So the Christians were for him the Bolshevists of the Roman Empire who had ruined the Roman Empire. And those Bolshevists whom he was fighting, these were the heirs of Christianity and of Judaism. So we have to see, on the other side we have theorists, right? There is a fascist theory of the world. And if you are inside of this theory, it seems to be quite logical. It would be fantastic when you work yourself into it. You will see that these guys were completely normal in terms of their own logic. It is just when you get out of this worldview that it becomes so peculiar. But don't forget now that we are sitting in a worldview too, which is called liberalism. And what sounds for us so normal and so on is strange for the others. When they go into our worldview, it also seems to be logical. But when they look from a socialist or fascist point of view, they think strange things about us. So we have to relativize, in a certain sense, ourselves. If we make our own worldview absolute or whatever, or infallible, then we would not understand others well. But just one element of similarity. So Hitler, for instance, in the Wolfschanze there, he thought when he was finished with the Russian war, victoriously of course, that then he would retire. He would do a few government things, but then he would retire to Berchtesgaden, which was the house which he had built down in the Alps. And then he would study art. He was some kind of an artist. He could paint well. And he was some kind of fascinated by architecture, and so that's what he wanted to do. And he wanted to study philosophy. He was a Schopenhauerian. He carried in the First World War Schopenhauer's works in his bag. And the last discussions with Dr. Goebbels in the Chancellery the telephone were about Schopenhauer. So he wanted to study Schopenhauer. Now, just think this man killed 27 million people, and then he wants to retire and wants to look at the Alps and wants to study. There is something horrifying about this, and something similar we have. You know that Bush was responsible for 1 billion people dead in Iraq, and not to speak of those in Afghanistan, and now in the last horrible act which he just did last week, by preventing an immediate armistice in the Gaza Strip, which is only 4 miles broad and 20 miles long, has 1.5 million people, and they bombarded the hell out of the whole thing. And the whole world wanted to that they would stop that immediately. 650 people have been killed, 2,000 have been wounded. The hospitals have no electricity, no medicine, and the doctors have been killed on top of it, and so on. So it is just hell. And he, because he hates Hamas as much as the Hezbollah and the Iranians, sacrifices this whole thing by blocking it in the Security Council. So, but now he wants to retire in Dallas. He has a few $1 million home, and there he wants to retire now, and peacefully. It is just something has happened to the human brain in a certain sense, and this is what the critical theory is so somehow moved by, and where they would like to find a solution to this, what has happened to our evolution. That this is possible, that one thinks one can go to Berchtesgaden and sleep well and study art after one has done all this. Or it does. I mean, they said recently in Dallas, not everybody will love him there. So, his neighbors, some of them will like that he is there, others will hate him because he's there. I heard a long report now, his whole cabinet is under war crime suspicion because of waterboarding, which has been ruled out. And we initiated this, by the way, originally. In 1984, it became part of the Geneva Convention, and so therefore 150 whatever nations have signed up to it. That means they cannot travel anymore. The Bush cannot leave the country. That means these people all these nations have taken upon themselves the obligation to catch those guys. I mean, with torture alone. Outsourcing of torture, waterboarding, and so on. And then not to speak of the other, to initiate 2 wars, That means a war criminal under suspicion. So there will be investigations, and the question is the investigation will lead to a trial, and then either national trial that is tried here, or that he and all of them rise, and so on. Or that there will be an international trial. And under no circumstance, as soon as they lose immunity on the 20th of January, they cannot leave the country anymore. So, and they knew this. I mean, we mentioned that, I mentioned that now for 6 or 7 years. So, but that is, that has something to do with the critical theory was developed against this folkishness, against this nationalism, against this fascism, this national socialism. It was also developed against what is called red fascism. That means what went wrong in the Soviet Union in terms of what the original theory was, what Lenin did to it in order to adapt it St. Petersburg and then Moscow and the revolution there, and then what became of it under Stalin, whom he never wanted as his successor. And he was assassinated by a medical student of another branch of socialism, but he didn't die right away, but he slowly withered away. And during this time he expressed this, that he was psychologically not the right man. But they have no psychology. So what came then is what was called by the Frankfurt School, by Habermas and others, the red fascism. So there's brown fascism, the brown shirts, and then there's this red fascism. When not only when the Soviet Union used fascist means, so for instance, waterboarding or torture would be a fascist means. People can use fascist means without being fascists right away. But the Gulago and all this, Dustin has written a wonderful piece on that in terms of Islamic fascism. This word came up, Bush used it several times, and they told him it wasn't a good word, and he didn't use it anymore. And so people sometimes may do things which look very fascist, but that does not make them fascist yet. So, but when you have some kind of corporatism, when you have a combination of the government and the corporation, like it was in the Soviet Union, then it becomes some kind of a fascist system with a socialistic name, and maybe also all kinds of socialistic parts to it, because it would be an interesting study to see to what extent Hitler fulfilled some of his socialistic promises. It was called social national socialism. So he was certainly a nationalist, but the question is, did he also have socialistic things? And he did. The workers did not pay taxes, for instance. There was power through joy. Every worker, could have vacations where he was taken on ships, in the North Sea, on the Rhine River, and so on. So they did all kinds of things.
They're renovating one of these old
right, socialistic ideas.
Nazi, what is it, on an island on Jutland.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the vacation places and so on. Yeah. So, but it would be, nobody has really done this, because his whole thing was so nationalistic that this came into the foreground. There was a left to Hitler's party. He was on the right, and the left wanted to nationalize everything, and he stopped right away in 1933, already in the fall, where he said, the world will, history, he also had this idea that history would judge him, that history would judge them not according to how many capitalists they would put into prison or execute, but rather how many workers would have jobs. And so in 1934 he gave 7 million workers jobs. If you want to ask why they all were shouting so loud and loved him and thought he was the Messiah, and they were only 50 million people. So a nation of 50 million people, he gave 7 million, and let's say maybe the 7 was a little bit exaggerated, but everybody is sure that it was 6 million. 6 million people workers, what the fellow here, Obama, promises now, 2.5 million jobs. Sometimes when he's very optimistic, he says 5 million jobs. But he will have to spend $850 billion in order to get to that level. And you can imagine what a messianic dimension was to that Hitler guy there. Not to speak of the theater. They had the whole, Fascism had an aesthetical dimension. All the little bitty Hitler Youth girls there with their little skirts, and the boys with their little pants and so on, running and well organized and all this. It was fascinating, if you see those movies which they have about the Olympics or whatever. They had some photographers who were artists and could represent this. And Hitler was coming down, in a Lufthansa airplane. He came like the Messiah coming out of the sky, and so it was. There were quasi-religious dimensions to all of this. Okay, but let me just go to this thing there, how I got in contact with these people and what went there before. So what went there before is that I grew up there in this Volksstraße was the name. The house was not bombed out. The house on the outside were bombed out, but this was standing. So, and I would always like to go back to this apartment. I like to do this, but I don't dare really. People get frightened. When suddenly a stranger comes and says, can I look into your kitchen there? I grew up here, or whatever. So I did this once in Washington. I came with a state car from Michigan, and I went to the house of my wife where she grew up, and black people were living in the house. And so as I approached, and they saw the sign of Michigan, and so they were so frightened the Gestapo was coming or whatever. So it took me so long time to persuade them, and in the end I didn't want to go in any way to, it is private and you don't want to go into this, but it is still there. So and I can therefore reconstruct when you can remember and think of the walls and the doors and the staircase and so on. You see that a lot of memories, come back with the space in which things took place. So if you want to conjure up some scenes in your life, then think of the house in which it took place or the street or whatever, and you'll see then most of the time a lot of stuff comes back again. So nevertheless, but there was no contact there. I had the Frankfurt school. They were there up to 1933. Horkheimer lived in the Taunus Mountain, and since he was rich, in terms of his background, he had a nice house there, and so they met in the towns when Homburg was one of the places, and they were well to do up there, and like Hölderlin and Hegel and Schelling before they also had met in Frankfurt. So they now, together developed not an idealism, but a materialistic type of a theory. And now we have to be careful with all these words, and you can always interfere, Sometimes we think we know what that means, materialism, but it's worthwhile to clarify it. Materialism was developed by French doctors, by medical doctors. And that shows you already, that a materialist is somebody who is in touch with the body, with the suffering of the body. And they became materialists because they thought that these wonderful systems of these idealists were just walking over the suffering of the masses of the people. So materialism means, to look at the frustration of life, the meaninglessness of life, the war-dead people, the concentration camps. That means to become sensitive, and not to say, as we have said recently, Bush started that, so what, 1 million people died in Iraq, so what? And so every 5 minutes he says, so what? There is the difference, the coldness, and that is what the materialists wanted to break through, Marx already, And then there is this bourgeois materialism, which means, you want to have a good living standard and a nice car, sex car and career, and so on. But then there is this dialectical materialism. So there are all kinds of materialism, medical one, dialectical one, simply bourgeois one. And one service we can do, to our miserable situation in which we find now, the breakdown of capitalism and so on. The finance minister in Germany has just said, I hate to say it, he said, but I think Karl Marx may have been right with his crisis theory, and the idea of overproduction. And the Germans are storming the libraries now in order to find the works of Marx again. And so all around the world, because they finally, by the way, there you have an intellectual, right? So if we want to know what an intellectual is, Marx would be a good example, and of course Freud, and also of course Hegel and Kant and so on. So we have a lot of examples what an intellectual is, and then we know also what an intellectual may not be, or so. And then, what a conformist and a nonconformist, yes.
What's the difference between dialectical materialism and historical materialism?
Yeah.
They're synonymous, or?
Yeah, they are synonymous, the two. Only the Soviet Union used them mainly dialectical materialism, and in order to differentiate themselves from this, they then used more historical materialism. But Marx had used both of them. But our, we have to say a lot of this, but in a moment I want to say, that materialism is not something bad, because in this bourgeois society we have all this political idealism, particularly in the election time, it becomes very idealistic, and then we fall back into the bourgeois materialism, and then we kind of climb up these idealistic things again. So, and this idealism, that is somehow, when we say, we lost 5,000 men in Iraq, and 3,000 injured and wounded, and many of them mentally, and if you say, well, they sacrificed their life for our nation, and so that's idealistic. And behind this idealism, the detail of the suffering of being handicapped for the rest of your life, to walk around with one leg or whatever, and this is all overshadowed by this glorious, sacrificing your life for the nation, and so on. And it means also that the individual is subordinated under the totality of a nation or a civilization or whatever. And so what materialism means is that you are concerned with the body, you're concerned with pain. So when somebody says waterboarding, that you're not thinking, well, that's a higher purpose. The higher purpose of this is investigation, because if you waterboard this terrorist, then he will tell you where the next terrorist attack will take place, and so on and so on. And then you forget completely what that means, waterboarding. I mean, I always said, the president should just go in the swimming pool and should tell some of the FBI people or the CIA to do that to him, What that means, when they put you backward, down under the water, you think you die, your whole body, the nervous system, the automatic nervous system, everything rebels against this, and so what that means, and this is all forgotten, because of notions and concepts and so on, instead of having more feelings and empathy. I know when my son, who studied here, he's a lawyer now in New York, but when he came home one day and said, our teacher said there is no empathy. I was just frightened stiff, There is no empathy. That means that you cannot feel with the feeling of the other. I can very well feel what somebody feels if he is waterboarding. But if I say, we need this in order to prevent the next terror attack and so on, in order to protect the fatherland and so on, then all that is gone. That is what idealism means. And that is what they turned against. So in order to really feel what happened in the First World War, and in between, and of course they were Jews, so all what happened to the Jews and the Crystal Night and so on, and the gassing and all that, always this attitude that so what, happens all the time, we all have to die. Sometimes when my Muslim students, we talk about the theodicy problem, and then they read the story of my wife who died from cancer 30 years ago, and then usually the comment which they make, we all must die. That is a universal type of a sentence, and it's true enough, it's just the fate of the species that all have to die. But when you say the sentences, you are not concerned with the particular and the singular type of dying to which people have to go. And so it is a different mindset in a certain sense. And when you are an idealist, you shut out certain things and you don't see them. You don't see the deficiency of your own idealistic position. For instance, that this torture is proven to be counterproductive. They don't get out of people what they don't want. What do you think? What if they water? If you die, if they put you in the water, whatever, or whatever they do, or take sleep deprivation or whatever, it can be so terrible that you tell them anything. And I think that the false information which the government have continually has something to do that they press things out of them, which these people just said in order to stop it, just stop putting me underwater all the time, and so said whatever they wanted to know, Yeah. Yes, break in whenever you want to, right? And if whenever I say something, you want to make a comment on something, always come in, right?
Idealism and materialism, are they still both emphasizing norms? Are they both normative, or is one more decisionistic?
No, they have both norms, but some of them deduct their norms from a highest principle, and the others, the materialists, would come up with their norms. When you read Brecht, for instance, come up with norms of what happens immediately to people, So the question is where, when we have the change, from idealistic dialectics to materialistic one and so on, it has, of course, something to do with where you start. So Hegel starts with God, He talks with the Logos. That means he talks in terms of the first chapter of John's Gospel, and the Word, the Logos, was with God, and the Logos was God. And whatever was created through the Logos, and the Logos became flesh, and so on, and lived among us, and so on, and so on. That is the whole Hellenistic Christian basis. That's idealism. So, but let's take something from the New Testament. When you say, believe in the kingdom first, and everything will be given to you, that is an idealistic sentence. And Hegel already, and then Marx and so on, turned that around. Get housing and food and so on first, and then you will get the kingdom in addition to it. That's a turn, it's an upside down type of a thing, from an idealistic position from above, the kingdom first, and then you will get food and so on. Or to turn around, no, give those workers and so on food and so on, then the kingdom will come by itself. So there's it's a turning upside down position. But, the whole issue, the whole antagonism between the two, Marcuse wanted to write a reader once with all the others about materialism in great thinkers in Greece and the Middle Ages and so on. Because there is almost no idealistic thinker like Plato and Aristotle or whatever who does not have a materialistic element to him, a materialistic dimension. The book was never written. One could still write it, to put it together and see. The greatest of all idealists was Hegel, greater than Plato and so on, as an idealist. But there are very tough, analysis of human suffering in the historical process. He calls history the slaughter bench of history, the Golgotha of history, where people and the masses are crucified and so on. So Schopenhauer, was, of course, the father of metaphysical pessimism. He emphasized, of course, the horror and terror. But there are passages in Hegel, where you can easily compete with what Schopenhauer said. But when Hegel then describes that slaughter bench, but then comes and says, we must not come from below, really, an inductive method, but we must come from above. That means we have to start out with what the Greek called reason, and we have to start out with the Hebrew prophets called the providence and so on. And then from then we will get a completely different view of what the suffering is about, namely that the God changes the negative always into something positive, that the negative is also the positive, and so on. Then it becomes idealistic, and then Schopenhauer just outraged about this cursed optimism, and he made all kinds of charges against Hegel that he looked like an innkeeper and had a beer nose. They taught at the same time in the University of Berlin, and of course people want to be optimistic. So Hegel's optimism was something which attracted people. So Schopenhauer made a test, and he put his class at the same time as Hegel, and nobody came into his class. So he was sitting in the class, was all empty. All the guys went over to Hegel, and he left Berlin. He never went back to Berlin again, and went to Frankfurt. He had a little pension in Frankfurt, and then bought himself a dog, and hated women for the rest of his life, which is not entirely true. I think he proposed to a woman. My friend Hans Küng said that at least, that he did propose and he was rejected or whatever. But according to him, he just hated them. If you go to women, it's just, he had horrible ideas about women. And Nietzsche then, inherited this and so on. But that is a whole other thing why that happened. So, but nevertheless, our point is, that when we want to know the motivation, then the motivation was against Hegel by Schopenhauer, but also by Marx and so on, that Hegel was so concerned with the holistic approach, the totality of nations and the human species, Kierkegaard too. The rebellion against Hegel because he did not see the individual in his finitude, in his dying, in his getting old, in his being alone, and all this. And that is the emphasis then on materialism. So that when they don't start now with reason and government, that means reason and providence, that means deductively, but they start inductively. Where do they start then? Well, they start with the human potentials. That means they start either with language and memory, because that is something very individual and personal and so on. Or they start with work and tool. So Marx did that, Or they start with sexuality, and eroticism, and Freud did this. Or they start with the struggle for recognition, struggle for power, and Nietzsche did that. So after the big system collapses, then people take fragments of that system, and they refuse to make the presupposition that there is a highest principle in the beginning, and that everything, may go into the dark, but also returns again, like all the world religions do. But they now concentrate on that suffering, which there is no end to it. Now, these world religions, of course, give hope there should be an end to all of this, but it doesn't come. There's the parousia delay. The Jews wait already for 2,800 years, and the Christians for 2,000 years, and the Muslims for 1,400 years, and that Messiah does not come, and Shalom and Salam does not come, and Pax and peace and whatever. So then they concentrate on the suffering which is going on. So what Marx says in the first volume, the introduction to the first volume of the Capital, is people say now Hegel is a dead dog. He would say that very often for great intellectuals, that they are dead dogs, and then they suddenly wake up again in a certain rhythm. So we have a huge Hegel society here in the United States, and one Hegel renaissance after the other, so he's far from being dead. But at the time, 1880, he was dead for a moment, and so Hegel said, I am his student. I'm criticizing him, but we would not be there without him. And you have that everywhere, where people say, this is wrong with Hegel, and this is wrong, and he doesn't look at the individual, and so on. But then nobody would say that this is not the highest whatever has been reached in philosophy, as far as philosophy goes, The question is only if one maybe should lay philosophy behind in order to talk about real things. So what he did with this, the dialectics does not start with God, either in the Jewish sense or in the Christian sense or in the Muslim sense and so on, but it starts from below. It starts from our being able to speak, to work, to love, to struggle for power, and to be in community in terms of tribes and nations and so on. So that is the real stuff, and over this real stuff it may look as if they were then atheistic or whatever. But it is not a materialistic atheism, it is not a materialistic metaphysics that the universe, has no origin of some kind or whatever. It is rather in that more immediate sense. That means we need some kind of a way to get unity in our life. And for religious people, God does that. But if you don't have this anymore, or it's not plausible, then you take some of these immediate potentials or evolutionary universals, and they become the way how you organize the life around you and try to make sense of it. So then sex decodes our behavior. But as Freud, it's not only sex, it's also selfishness, it's also the death drive, and so it's not that simple. Or that work, if you understand work, you understand history. You understand work, you understand classes and the class struggle, and so on. Or if you have language, the grammar of our living together, and so on. And that's today Apple and Habermas, and so on. So, and that can all be called materialistic, in the sense it is coming from below. So, materialism is not, I'm just for money and steal $50 billion or whatever from the charities. That can also be called materialistic, but that is just a very small thing, and it's some kind of everyday view of what a materialistic person is. Okay, so nevertheless, let me start. I had these, I had the experiences, of course, with the political scene. Hitler came to Frankfurt. My father took me there, and it was, even for a little guy, it was a nervous affair where masses of people were in motion, a little bit of the Obama thing, where populism, there it was left-wing or right-wing populism, rather. When you want to know that, McCain had some problem. There was a woman who said, this Obama, he is an Arab. And so McCain said, no, that's not right. He's not an Arab. By the way, he did not say that there's nothing wrong with the Arabs. He just said, so logically there's the universal Arabs, and then there is Obama is an Arab. So he said, no, he took Obama, the particular, out of the universal, but he didn't change the bad universal Arabs. But nevertheless, then people began to boo. He had right-wing populism in his background. They booed at him when he said, no, Obama is an honorable guy and he's not an Arab, which means the Arabs are not honorable guys. There are a lot of them in Detroit and many other places. So, he had this right-wing populism, and he could not control it at some places. He was not of that kind, McCain, He comes from an admiral family and so on. He's far from any mob scene or whatever. So it got out of hand in a certain sense, and he certainly didn't like it. So, nevertheless, I experienced it, and the whole thing, he usually came 20 minutes late, sometimes half a minute late, and that was part of the whole scenery, part of the whole show, because the excitement was growing, the Führer leader is coming, and so on, and then masses and masses of people, and that convinces a lot of people. So many people cannot be wrong. Well, lots of people can be wrong, that's it, certainly. But nevertheless, and in my family, my grandfather, the streetcar conductor, he was a social democrat, so they were on the left. And then his sons became National Socialists. And the reason for that, particularly is one of them, is that he looked Jewish. And he thought if he would join the party early, and he did, then they would forgive him that he looks Jewish.
This is
your father?
No, my mother. My mother looked Jewish.
Okay.
And my uncle looked Jewish, and my daughter Maria looks Jewish. So something happened in our family, but nobody could prove, that there was a little Jew sitting on the family tree somewhere. On the other side, the class line went through our family. So on one side, we had bakers, but also, streetcar conductors, and on the other side we had judges, and so the judge was able to look at the Siebert line, and he could prove, from generation to generation, up to 1500, that there was no Jew sitting on any branch, and that we were absolutely pure. And this uncle, the judge, he put me into a little Hitler Youth uniform when I was only 4 years old. And I marched through the town, and he was the master of the town, and I had this little uniform on with the guard with us in front, and a brown shirt and all this. So he was, and he believed in all these agricultural things, the farms stay with the oldest son, and that Germany needed land, and of course they had to steal it from the Russians, and all this horrible stuff. He was presiding over a district where he had jurisprudence, and the synagogue was burned down. I came one year and the synagogue was not there anymore. I had my own fun with that synagogue, and Augustine wrote these confessions where he brings all the sins of his youth. I should write something like this. I was sitting in a tree and looked through the window of the synagogue, and they were all there and praying and moving back and forth, and I thought that was funny. So I made just all kinds of strange gestures through the window, and so the rabbi and so they got very angry, and they all came out of the synagogue who were running behind me. So I was running around the whole little mountain in the cemetery, and they couldn't catch me and so on. So next time I was sitting again up there and make funny when they, and so it was just horrible. But I loved them. I had good friends. They say my best friends are Jews, but nevertheless, they lived on a mountain right under the castle where my uncle lived, and so I crawled down that thing and played with them down there. But it just looked funny how they, made all these gestures and bowing down and so on. So, and one summer I came, and it was all burned down, and all the whole hill with Jewish homes had all gone. And my uncle didn't say anything, but he was in charge, That was a crime against people, and he did not intervene. He was either frightened or he was convinced, that the SS was right. But he also against normal criminal people who were poor, and he owned a river, the Ulster it's called, and they caught fish, and he would go there with his policemen, and would run after them, catch them, put them into a prison. I visited the prisoners in this prison. The walls were dirty, and the policeman wife cooked for them. Heaven knows what she cooked. I can't remember anymore. But a horrible type of conditions. And my uncle did not intervene. He was a good Catholic. He went to church all the time. This is another strange mixture. We come from an inn family, from innkeepers, White Horse. We still have that inn. It was in the eastern part of Germany. And I talked with my relatives there once. A scene came, a German officer came into the inn in 1943 or whatever, and his hands were all bloody. And he said, "This is Polish blood." And so what they had done, the Polish soldier, prisoner of war, had made a German girl pregnant in the village and so on. So they cut the hairs off of both of them, and they were dragged from village to the marketplace and spit at and so on by the population. And my uncle was the head of the police force and did not intervene whatsoever. That was not even the SS, that was the army. But in the meantime, the army was as criminal very often as the SS was in Russia, and particularly these racial things. So I still, I have already written biographical stuff, and I want to put that together once more, because I have all his papers, I have his diaries, and he gave it to me. He had his good side. He knew that he was guilty. When the Russians came in, they thought they saw a picture of him with a student organization uniform, and they thought it was the officers. The Russian officers thought he was the SS, and took him out already to shoot him. A cleaning woman had betrayed him and went to the Russians, and so there was this class thing. And they sentenced him. He had to work in the mine, was all in his 50s and had a good life before, slept a lot and shouted at the farmers and so on, and suddenly he was humiliated, and had to work like everybody else every day, and so did all his mayor, and they were all hanging together. It was just a Nazi clique, and so. But how all this comes about, it should be written. People have requested a lot of this, but we should do that. So, nevertheless, so it was this, class thing went through the thing, and why they became party members was not necessarily, that they believed it or understood it, but they thought, they could protect themselves with their Jewish thing there. So, after the war, I exploded myself where this little Jew came from. Somehow something had happened to the genome, and I did not know where it was. So nevertheless, I went from Frankfurt east, north rather, from village to village, and you could, before 1880, the state did not register people, but only the churches. So therefore I had to go to all these Protestant churches and looked up, and so I went one generation, of our family, back and back and back, and then I get to 1720. And in 1720, a half-Jew, whose mother was Jewish, that makes him really Jewish, came into the village, and my ancestor, a woman, she had 5 children, land workers, and her husband had left her, and so this little Jew crawled into her bed and produced the 6th child, and this is in the background of my grandmother. And according to Nazi anthropology, it should disappear after the 7th generation. It is more than 7 generations, and it has not disappeared. This is a very tough gene we're sitting there, the genome. So, but it is nice. I mean, it's a very smart type of the genome, and so all of them who have that were very smart people. But what it does, is when this little Maria was born, all my children who were there already agreed that she did not belong to the family. That she was somehow put into that nest from outside. Like, for instance, you have in some birds, you have a nest, and somebody puts the wrong egg into it. So somebody put the wrong egg into the nest. And I caught my son once when he had a hammer and wanted to beat on the head of his little sister. And later on, they told her when I wasn't there, "You don't belong to us, really." And then she became very sad, Maria. She was beautiful. So I had to buy her a little cat all the time, so she had a friend at least. And so the cat usually healed her, and she became happy. And finally, she found a husband in Canada. She went into exile, so to speak, up to Frederick, the North Pole, where the bears are marching through the village. When it gets cold and so on. So poor thing. And I visited her. I taught there, also just to visit her. I taught there in the university, and I was the theology chair for some time there. So, nevertheless, these are very peculiar things for you or so, but it is the atmosphere, it's the context in which the texts are written, right? So, let's put it technically. The critical theory consists of discourses, and they are reflected in text, and these texts are, of course, like everything else, dependent on the context, and that was this strange context. When I came out of the parish there, where I had discovered this Jewish man who got in the family, I told my brother, and my brother, had some sympathy for the Hitler guy still, and he became pale. He almost got a heart attack when I told him this, and he said, it cannot be. And up to his death, he wanted us to go back and look up the whole thing once more. I said, I have the copies. It is true. I can't help it. It's history. But he did not want to believe that this had happened to us. So this anti-Semitism, is an unbelievably strong force. There is Egyptian anti-Semitism, Babylonian anti-Semitism, Roman, Greek, medieval, Catholic, Protestant, and secular now on top of it. It just does not stop, And so, obviously, anti-Semitism is a great motivating force for the development of the critical theory. It is then also other forms of hate, of ethnic hate as well. And what they have discovered about this, is also sometimes true for others. So Adorno, once in a letter which I found, developed some kind of a theory. So there is the critical theory as a whole, but there are partial theories in there. And the partial theory would be a psychoanalytical theory of anti-Semitism. And he thought for a moment, that it was the nomadic type of a thing which makes the Jews always so hated. That Abraham started from Ur, which is not too far away from Baghdad, and there was this vision, and then went to the Mediterranean, to Canaan, and then also to Egypt, and so on. So they moved between these wonderful, great cultures on which so much of us depends, our writing and everything. That means the Euphrates and Tigris civilization, and then the Nile civilization, and then there were the Indus civilization and the Yellow River civilization. So these are the four high civilizations with high religions and so on. And so the Jewish people walked with their camels there through this area, and the others had always, since 4,000, 5,000 and so on, they had developed agriculture. And agriculture means really the beginning of work, because you cannot, leave everything laying there and the rain takes place of it or the wind. You have to do it all yourself. And in order to get fruit out of the earth, you have to cultivate the soil and so on. That's really work. So, and when these people who were working in the field saw these guys, these nomads walking around, they looked like being on vacations. They looked to have a good life, because they were not restrained by the time to get up and take care of the chickens or whatever. But they just walked on, let it all lay there, and went to the next camp, and so on, gave birth and walked on, and so did the camels, and so on. That seemed to be it was not paradisical, I'm quite sure, but it looked like that. And it is possible, that then hate developed against those people, and that this is like in the symphony, that this is the motif, and then you have all the variations, of course, in all the cultures. But it may very well be that this is the continual motif, because we in Europe, people were in the villages and they worked hard as shoemakers and so on, and then there were these Jews, they did not work. The horrible irony was, of course, that they themselves prevented them from work, and then said Jews by nature do not work. If you go to Jewish Palestine, you'll see how hard they work. Go into a kibbutz, and you'll see what that meant to make fertile land out of this horrible desert and so on. South of Jerusalem, you have these with irrigation, you have these beautiful palm trees and vineyards and so on. So, they of course they can work there, but it looked in Germany, it looked as if Jew was never a worker. That means they pushed him into circulation, that means in trade and so on, because the guilds, were devoted to a saint, so-and-so, and they couldn't belong to that Christian guild. And so what did they do? They went to the entrance of the town, and when the farmers came with their 10 little pigs, they said, what do you want to have with the pigs? And they also had a certain dialect, some of them spoke Yiddish, and then they had these gestures, these Jewish gestures. Everybody knows not only the names, and the names also, very poetical names they had. So when I write the biography of my family in America, and they had a doctor so-and-so, right away that was a Jewish doctor, so already by the name. And so even when in late antiquity they mixed with other races, and so they do not look. My friend Gregory Baum, the Jew, does not look like Jesus. Jesus looks like the Muslim workers. They're the Arabic workers in the fields. They look thin and so on, but not round or whatever. So, but there remains always the nostralism here, how the nose is grown to the face, and you can always recognize them. Everybody in Germany, was trained, all over Europe was trained to see a Jew, like Marcuse, for instance. He looked Germanic. He had blue eyes, blonde hairs, and so on, but you couldn't find out he was right away, you knew, by all kinds of things. And there's nothing bad about it. So this alone would not produce anti-Semitism. So, some people look that way. But also when you see, on Wall Street, when the reports come for years and years, why the hell can they put an Aryan in there? There is this prejudice already against Jews in Wall Street, Ford had it here all over the place, and Hitler. And why do they have all these people who speak for Wall Street? Most of them are Jewish, So even when they make them blonde, it's still that way. So in order to counteract prejudice, the question is, what are you doing in order to counteract the prejudice? And the Frankfurt School has written lots and lots about these things, what one could do, but they are not doing it, Why must Greenspan be Greenspan, And then say in the end, that he is responsible for the whole catastrophe, but he didn't know it. It plays right into the protocol of the elders of science and so on. So it is. If I was a Jewish person, I would be much more careful with all of these things, and I don't know why they are not careful enough about this. So, but the nomadic type of a thing, the always wandering Jew who doesn't stay in one place, but used at least by the Christian population, And then he paid, 10 cents for each of the little pigs, and then he went 5 steps further and sold them on the market for 20 cents, And that is the beginning of merchant capital. That's how capitalism started in the West, and the Jewish people are connected with that, but not because of their genome or whatever, but because the situations in which the Christians had put them, And and this went also then, in all these villages there, north of Frankfurt, where my ancestors came from, they became all Nazi, and they became all anti-Semitic, and the Jews then, of course, got that money, accumulated the money, then they gave it for loans, and then they wanted to have interest for their loans. They could not take interest from their own people. That was usury. All three Abrahamic religions have under usury laws, but they could take it from the Gentiles. And so they did, and the farmers didn't understand that interest. Nobody understood how you can put, $2 pieces into a box and then comes a 50-cent baby out after 9 months or whatever. They could not understand that money is productive, and it's still a riddle today. You see, when all the paper of speculative capital suddenly loses all its values, of course, that the value of money rests in productive capital, as Ford called that, and Hitler too. So, nevertheless,
Break time.
Yes. Okay, let me just finish this up there about this Jewish thesis there, which the Frankfurt School developed. That it may be this nomadic type of a thing, and so they are always foreigners in a certain sense. And then the Romans destroyed Israel, and so they spread in the diaspora, and then could somehow not assimilate. But when they were given the chance of assimilation through the French Revolution, then they did assimilate, to the horror of the rabbis. They did assimilate to quite a large extent. Now, in the meantime, they repent all that and regret all that and would like to disassimilate again. So, that then envy develops, against them, against their culture, against their civilization, against their community. This astonishing phenomenon, not to have a state, but to stay together anyway, just bound together by the law and by the obedience to the law, and this for centuries, and to stay together under horrible poverty, very often in the Polish ghettos and so on, and have this high culture at the same time. This is an astonishing type of phenomenon, and may have, produced this envy. And then also, sometimes people who cannot believe certain things anymore become envious of the others who do not have to believe it. So when the Trinity, for instance, becomes, or the divinity of Christ or so, becomes somewhat questionable for people, and there are damn Jews, they don't have to believe it, they are free, and then a certain envy against them, and then also hate. Those who do not have to believe it, what you have to believe, and it is not plausible to you, then you hate those who don't have to do this. And so thousands of them were killed on Good Friday in Poland, in Russia, in Spain, everywhere, because they killed Christ, and after Christ had become God, they killed God. And very often this whole thing, was a very primitive divinization of Jesus among the farmers and so on. And so they had killed that God, and then they did not convert. They were stubborn, and the Messiah could not come before they would not convert, so they made him responsible that the hell went on and gave a taste of that hell for which they were responsible and so on. And then from the 19th century on, and the Frankfurt School were very much aware of this in France and in England, theoreticians came up and separated the Aryans from and they were always separated from the Semites, and first it was language from Norway and Sweden down to Sanskrit in India, the whole language community, and then the Semitic bloc in between, so out of this language theory then developed the racial biological theory, and that leads then finally to Chamberlain and to Hitler and the Wagner circle and all these things. And then when Hitler did not sign he produced the atmosphere in which that then the horror became possible. The same thing people are discussing now. The question is, for instance, if the horror which has happened and the torture and all this in Iraq and the Guantanamo Bay, if the president really signed off on this, or Rumsfeld and so on, that will be important for the investigations and for the trials. Some of them say, well, even if we cannot prove any signature or whatever, they produced an atmosphere in which these people who made that pyramid, the horrible pictures of Baghdad, where they put, these naked people on top of it, and the woman was there and made the victories or whatever, these horrifying things, that means they produced the culture in which they thought that this was acceptable. And if you once do that, you cannot really stop it anymore. If it trickles down, and people have that thing that we can do with those people whatever you want to, or you should even do with them, and so on. You don't have to sign up anything or sign off anything. They will do it all by themselves. You cannot stop it anymore. So all this will be if we don't have the political will and power in the country to do that, the people around us and the other nations will do it for us. So this. Just as a beginning, and when we come back, we can conclude with this here. So a short introduction, how I, came together with these Frankfurt people and what the bridges were, so that you know where I am coming from. Okay, so let's have 10 minutes rest now, and then we can come back. And whatever questions you have, please bring them up. Okay.